November 22nd, 1942. Army Group Don headquarters near Rostov. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein studied the situation maps spread across his command table, each red circle marking another crisis demanding immediate attention. 300,000 Axis personnel sat encircled in Stalingrad, cut off from supply and facing annihilation. The architect of victories in France and Sevastopol had been summoned from the Leningrad sector to attempt the impossible. What Manstein did not yet grasp was that the enemy he faced extended far beyond the Soviet armies crushing his front lines. The field marshal had built his reputation on precision and tactical brilliance, but the Eastern Front had evolved into something beyond conventional warfare. Behind German lines, a shadow war raged that headquarters barely acknowledged. Soviet forces had learned to strike supply columns, communication centers, and isolated garrisons with devastating effect. The rear areas that should have provided security and logistics had become hunting grounds. November 24th, 1942. Outskirts of Rostov. Manstein's staff briefed him on the deteriorating situation as his command train completed the journey from Army Group North. The encirclement at Stalingrad now trapped 300,000 Axis personnel, their ammunition and fuel dwindling with each passing day. But the reports filtering in from across the Don Bend revealed a broader collapse. Supply convoys vanished without trace. Communication lines went dead for days at a time. Entire rear area commands reported losing contact with their forward positions. The Soviet Union had weaponized its vast territory against the invaders. What German intelligence dismissed as scattered partisan activity was actually coordinated disruption on a massive scale. Every kilometer behind the front lines had become contested ground where German control existed only where German boots actually stood. Late November, 1942. Lower Chir River area. Manstein worked frantically to organize his depleted forces for the relief operation. General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army would spearhead the drive toward Stalingrad, but the promised 4 panzer divisions existed largely on paper. Units that should have been refitting and receiving replacements were instead scattered across hundreds of kilometers, trying to maintain some semblance of rear security. The mathematics of the Eastern Front had turned against Germany. Every advance stretched supply lines further into hostile territory. Every occupied village required garrison troops. Every bridge, railway junction, and supply depot demanded protection from an enemy that struck without warning and melted away before reinforcements could respond. If you want to understand how modern warfare really works when conventional armies meet unconventional tactics, make sure you subscribe to this channel. We dig into the battles that textbooks skip and the intelligence failures that changed history. December 16th, 1942. Don Front, left flank. The Soviet Operation Little Saturn smashed through the Italian 8th Army, opening a 175-mile breach in German defenses. Manstein watched his carefully planned relief operation collapse as enemy forces poured through the gap, threatening to encircle his own headquarters. The Italians had simply disintegrated under the assault, leaving behind equipment and fleeing westward in panic. This was the moment when the scale of Soviet rear area operations became impossible to ignore. The breakthrough had been preceded by weeks of systematic attacks on Italian supply lines, communication centers, and isolated strongpoints. By the time the main assault began, the Italian 8th Army was already crippled by shortages and demoralization. The enemy had learned to prepare the battlefield behind German lines before launching conventional attacks. Supply dumps exploded in the night. Telephone cables were cut faster than repair crews could restore them. Transport columns disappeared on roads that German maps showed as secure. December 18th through 19th, 1942. Stalingrad Corridor approach. General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army ground forward against mounting Soviet resistance, each kilometer costing irreplaceable men and machines. The relief force that had started with confidence now struggled against an enemy that seemed to anticipate every move. Casualties mounted as the advance stalled within sight of the Stalingrad perimeter. Manstein realized that his forces were fighting not just the Soviet armies blocking their path, but an entire system designed to bleed German strength. The rear areas that should have provided secure bases for the offensive had become sources of constant crisis. Units earmarked for the spearhead were diverted to deal with threats that materialized without warning across the entire front. The Soviet Union had turned its weakness into strength. Where German doctrine relied on secure rear areas and predictable supply lines, the Soviets had created chaos that consumed German resources faster than they could be replaced. December 23, 1942. Southern Chir River defenses. Manstein made the decision that sealed the fate of the Stalingrad garrison. With Soviet forces threatening to break through his overstretched lines, he halted the relief offensive and redeployed units to shore up his collapsing flanks. The 6th Army in Stalingrad would have to survive on its own. The field marshal, who had never lost a campaign, found himself defeated not by superior Soviet generalship, but by the cumulative effect of 1,000 small disasters behind his lines. Every supply convoy that failed to arrive, every communication center that went silent, every garrison that called for help had contributed to this moment of strategic paralysis. Manstein took command of Army Group Dawn on November 22, 1942, facing the encirclement of 300,000 Axis troops at Stalingrad. His relief operation collapsed from the systematic disruption of German rear areas by Soviet forces using unconventional tactics across hundreds of kilometers, combined with conventional Soviet offensives, resource shortages, and strategic constraints. The closest the sources come to major rear area impact is the broader collapse of rear security that Manstein confronted during Operation Little Saturn on December 16, 1942, when the Italian 8th Army's destruction opened a 175-mile gap in German defenses. This breakthrough had been prepared by weeks of attacks on supply lines and communication centers that German intelligence had failed to recognize as coordinated operations. Soviet rear area warfare contributed to the cumulative effect of constant pressure that German commanders could never quite grasp. Manstein's failure to relieve Stalingrad marked the moment when Germany's Eastern Front strategy collapsed under the weight of fighting an enemy that refused to respect the boundaries between front and rear, between soldier and civilian, between conventional battle and total war. The 300,000 men trapped in Stalingrad would surrender in February 1943, victims not just of Soviet armies, but of a form of warfare that German doctrine had never anticipated. Behind every failed supply run and severed communication line lay the reality that the Soviet Union had weaponized its own territory against the invaders.